Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. Your campus already uses ChatGPT, Claude, and Copilot. Here's how to make them research ready, which is sponsored by Scite by Research Solutions. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Also, if you're interested in library technology, LibTech Insights, or LTI, is a content vertical from Choice that examines the day-to-day impact of library and education technology on librarians, researchers, and students. The channel provides practical guidance on technology trends and products, including AI and AI literacy, user experience, useful tools, and job profiles, all of which are written by and for librarians. You can find out more about LTI and read the blog via the links in the chat. We send out one email a week with our latest posts and some handpicked tech news stories, usually in the realm of AI. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for the captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And with that, we are ready to get started. So I will now hand it over to Sean and Drew.
Yeah, great, Sabrina. Thank you. Thank you much. We're going to talk today about AI tools and you and how to sort of integrate that with your research process. So my name is Sean Reif. I'm one of the co-founders of Scite.ai. I'm also a professor of psychology at Murray State University. Drew, do you want to jump in? Just introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Drew Barantini. I'm the VP of product for Scite. So I work across design, engineering, strategy to figure out what things we should build and how to get them in the hands of researchers.
Great. Yeah. So we're excited to be here. And today we're going to cover a number of different things. Just real quick, give you an overview. So we're going to start by sort of understanding the technology that underlies LLMs, why they produce sometimes unique problems and sort of unique solutions. We'll talk about the position of the library related to that technology. We'll talk about some more practical issues in terms of individual tools, integrating that with budget, and also some of the more administrative and analytical aspects. And then Drew's going to give us a live walkthrough of some of the tools that Scite provides, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the very end. So to get us started today, I'm just going to throw out a poll here if we want to go ahead and get that started. And basically what we're just trying to get a feel for is, what AI tool, what frontier tool, or something like it that you're currently using. And the way we frame this is sort of for research. So that could either, be in your own research, in your own work, or if it's easier, you can think about this in terms of, what the faculty and students at your institutions might be using. So going through, ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, Perplexity, something that maybe was internally built at your institution, or maybe if you're not using AI tools. So yeah, go ahead and just fill that out. And I'm a ChatGPT guy, have been for a long time. Also a big fan of Claude. I know that a lot of this is sometimes driven by institutional subscriptions, and a number of places have Microsoft subscriptions and Copilot. So a lot of different options there. And then, of course, the one at the very bottom, if you're not using anything like that yet, but maybe you're here because you're interested, hopefully you can provide some additional context and information to help you make that decision. Oh, there we go. So yeah, ChatGPT and Copilot almost perfectly tied. for number one, followed by Claude. So yeah, and then getting into Google. So yeah, this is pretty much what we would expect based on uptake from, sort of general more market research oriented stuff. But yeah, ChatGPT and Copilot coming in there at number one and two. Yeah, so we'll talk about some integrations and some different ways of sort of integrating sites data with these tools here in a minute. But I'm going to hand it over to Drew for a second here, and he's going to talk about the underlying technology.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. Um, Actually, I think this is, yeah, we can jump in here. So obviously, we're seeing that a lot of researchers and individuals are using AI tools every day. It's becoming more and more part of the workflow and across the tool set that we just talked about. So all these different tools, we have ChatGPT, Claude, there's different models, there's different providers, and a lot of this does rely on, individual preferences or what your institution has access to. But I think these numbers will continue to grow and climb in terms of usage frequency over time. And, the thing about these tools is they're really powerful, but can we trust them? Can we trust the output from them? And this is a question even beyond scientific literature and, academic institutions and that process and research workflows. This is, if you're asking any question really, making sure that you get verified, validated responses. So you've probably all seen some of these stories that have popped up in different articles or use cases individually where you would ask a question to ChatGPT and it would provide, references or some bibliographic or bibliography data that is just completely made up. They're DOIs that look real. They're formatted like a DOI would be formatted, but they're just not real at all. And they can hallucinate. So that's just a term that's used as part of this large language model technology, where it's making up some text that isn't verified or valid because it's just predicting text from patterns. These aren't real facts. It's not checking what it's doing. I don't think anyone's had an experience where the LM has said, I don't know, like a human might if they don't contain that knowledge. And the mental model I often tell people is think of an LLM like a very advanced autocomplete. We have sort of this AI in our head, artificial intelligence around a lot of, sci-fi and information over time, but really these tools are powerful, but they are pattern matchers. So with that inherently does come some problems and making sure that you can trust the outputs. So how exactly do they hallucinate and what does that really look like? Because that's obviously a major problem and that's something that we've tried to build on site to improve that. So LLMs are trying to predict plausible text. It's trying to auto-complete that based off of all the data that it's trained on. It's not there to try and verify the facts or review to make sure those are real papers, to make sure they're grounded in science. So it might just make up DOIs that look good, but they never existed. It might misrepresent findings. So maybe there is a real paper or a real author that's represented, but AI just says something that is the opposite of what is actually illustrated in that paper. So obviously this is, a larger, philosophical kind of existential thing from humans engaging with these technologies, but particularly in research, figuring out when the human in the loop makes the most sense to be part of that process, and also how we can enable better tooling to give you the ability to trace that verification all the way through. So that's really what we're trying to do with Scite is we're trying to change how the answers come back, how these tools are leveraged, but within the same workflow, asking natural language questions, viewing responses, looking at papers, reviewing the findings, seeing how ideas connect between different papers, what is citing what. So we've built a very massive citation index of over 1.6 billion citation statements. So we're trying to create these really rich qualifiers across a wide range of data, looking at the full text, past titles and abstracts, to try and classify not just that something was cited, but how it was cited. And that's what we call smart citations, which are signals that help the AI focus on real literature from the full text that you can trace all the way through. So if you're using Scite in a tool like ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot, those answers are grounded in those smart citations that are built off of that full text, that are built off of real, valid research. And we always make it as easy as possible to make sure that all those responses actually link to a verified text that you can trace all the way through, including your own institutional holdings. So if you have access to a certain journal or publication, you can trace that all the way through. So it comes up in the response, but there's also a way for you to see that PDF itself, that source material. And this is where you can blend the benefits of AIs with the downside of what can happen if things hallucinate, making sure that the researcher and the human in the loop is still there to trace that all the way through. Now, I keep saying MCP, and there's other terms around things like API. APIs have been around for a very long time on the web. It stands for Application Programming Interface. The MCP is something newer. So Anthropic, who makes Claude, actually released this back in 2022. This was a new kind of way of connecting to external data sources, but fundamentally APIs and MCPs do similar things. They're trying to connect to external data sources so that you can use them in a specific way. For APIs, this is something that is very common in more software development and programming because it's usually developers that are building custom tools. And we see a lot of organizations who are building their own internal tools using some of these open models from Anthropic, from OpenAI, and others to build a research workflow around that. So that's where you might use an API. You get more flexibility, but it does require some programming knowledge, and you can use this to build a specific workflow, custom literature review tools, or some sort of R&D platform that you want to use. And this is something that a dev team could use because they can leverage the Scite API that's built on that same smart citation data, that's built on all that full text and all that content we have access to, but in a very flexible way that you can integrate. And then on the MCP side, this is something that you can use inside of these AI tools. It's a lot easier. You don't have to write any code inside of the ChatGPT store, which I'll show a little bit later, or the Claude connectors. They all call them different things, but you can just click a few buttons and connect these external data sources into those tools that you're already using. So this works inside ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, Cursor, all sorts of other tools that are adopting this standard. And so what's important to know about these acronyms is that they're standards. So it makes it easy to use this across a broad range of things that implement those standards, which means that us at Scite can develop these tools that can be used by all in different environments. So you get all that access to that Scite data without leaving Claude or ChatGPT. You can ask your questions and you get a response, and it's not going to hallucinate because it's based in real literature. And another way that we think about Scite in general is we have different ways that you can access Scite. So it's all part of one larger platform. It's all tied to the same data that we've been talking about, but we want to make it easy and flexible to adapt to different research workflows. So our Scite platform is at scite.ai. This is a web interface that we actively maintain and build and improve. You can search literature through our AI assistant that we have, as well as our search product. You can build collections of organizing data and research. You can get alerts and build up your profile and view other authors and all sorts of data and information there. A full workflow is supported across individuals and teams. We have free trials and free accounts you can test out, but that is our primary web platform. It's powered by the API. So we have our API available that allows developers, and if you have an engineering team that wants to build some custom tools on top of that data, maybe do something similar to our platform at scite.ai, but in a homegrown, custom-built application, you can use the API. And then the MCP, which is what we'll talk about more specifically later when we get into the live demonstration. But this is where you can use that same data set inside of ChatGPT or Claude or Copilot. It takes your account, it connects it to your Scite account, and then you have access to that. You can have a natural language conversation. And we're seeing so much value out of this from a research perspective because you can ask questions in a single thread. You can have rich artifacts generated, HTML reports, PDFs, PowerPoint presentations, Word docs, all these standardized research outputs can be created through MCP, and it's just there by default. And there's a lot of really fun things that I want to show off a bit later. And, we've mentioned this multiple times, but it's a point worth reiterating. There's a huge gap between just having citations and actually trusting them. And 88% of researchers don't trust LLM answers without citations. So primary concern is that there's accuracy and I trust the outputs themselves. But then there's also a concern around the quality and the ability to verify the source. So citation quality is something that we focus on heavily when it comes to our smart citations to provide more context. And then the source verification is really making sure that you can trace that through all the way to even what your institution has access to or that source material so that you know that this is grounded in real research that you can trace all the way to the end. And you can see there's lots of different other concerns, but those are the primary top two at least. And so, as I mentioned here, citing something 15 times or knowing that a paper was cited 15 times doesn't really tell you much. The analogies I like to use are more in, if you think about Rotten Tomatoes scores in the movie space, knowing that a movie has 10,000 reviews doesn't really tell you much. It just means lots of people reviewed it. Or an Amazon product has 10,000 reviews. Again, means lots of people used it. Did they like it? Did they not like it? So smart citations is our attempt to tell you something meaningful about that number. So for a given paper, were the findings generally supported, or were they just being mentioned kind of more generally, more neutral, or was it contrasting? And this is really valuable when it comes to research because you're looking at the data and maybe you want to understand what's the highly debated, highly contested part of the research. So you want to see I just want to see the contrasting papers here, like what's something that I can go deeper into and there's research gaps here, or you want to look at what's supporting there and look at the validations behind that. So we spend a lot of time on this, and everything that we index builds these really rich citations. And again, this is based off of full text, open access content, the full text that we have publisher agreements with to reach past titles and past abstracts to give you that rich context. And again, this is also the thing that helps the LLMs stay grounded in real research with real DOIs, with all of that context that can help you get to the answer faster in a way that you can trace all the way through. So what does this look like in Scite itself? So I'm showing an example here of inside of our platform, the web interface at scite.ai. This will come out a little different if you're using MCP or API, but again, the data itself is still the same. It's powered by that same underlying technology. So we're surfacing for this paper the citation statement. This is the actual snippet. We tell you where it comes from in that paper. Is it part of the discussion? Is it part of the results? Where in the text does it actually surface? And we also provide some confidence scores because as much as we wish that all the machines were 100% perfect all the time, they are not. We're trying to be more conservative towards things just mentioning and looking at what's truly supporting, what's truly contrasting. But we always provide a confidence score there to help you understand how confident are we in this particular rating around this sentiment of this snippet. You can also see all the typical metadata you'd expect, author information, journal, and then we have our Smart Citation badge. So this badge shows those same counts we've talked about before. The total citation counts, the number that were supporting the findings, the number that were just mentioning them, and the ones that were contrasting. And then, when we talk about all of this, how do we actually build this data? So for a number of years now, we've been working with publisher partners, and this has continued to grow over time, which is what this chart illustrates. Our smart citation count over time has grown because we've been building these publisher agreements where we can take their full catalog and any new papers that are coming out, and we continually bring those in so that we can build smart citations, so that we can build the full text we have access to. So this happens on whether you're inside the platform itself in the web interface, whether you're in the MCP, or whether you're using the API. You have this really rich data, and we've built this really unique data set of all these publisher agreements on top of all the open access content that we can ingest as well, to make sure that we can build all of that context for you to provide the smart citation data along the way. So now I'm going to pass it back over to Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. That's really helpful. Thanks for giving us the overview here. So I'm going to take just a few minutes and talk about how this technology relates to the library. And I'm really going to make the argument, very much sort of based on this quote that we have up on the screen now from Mark at Pepperdine. I'm going to make the case that the library is where this technology should live, and for a number of different reasons. So for one thing, you have institutional neutrality. The library doesn't owe allegiance to any, department or any particular, company or vendor or any particular office necessarily at an institution. So it really does make it sort of the natural place where, AI will sort of come into contact with IT, research, grad students, faculty, higher level administration folks all at one time. It's also a place where you really do have a high level of established trust. And sometimes when I talk to librarians, I think understandably, folks think of this as a technology that's going to replace them. Why do we need librarians if we have this technology? And I understand where that comes from, but I think actually the opposite is really true. For the same reason why we actually need more radiologists today, even though AI is really good at reading radiology pictures. We actually need more because that technology, that process is being used more and more. And so we need more and more experts who can help interface with that technology. In the same way, I think we're going to actually need more and more expertise in the realm of information curation and consumption and education about this technology and how to use it ethically and effectively. And the library is where that expertise really does live. So that trust element and that sort of stakeholder element is really important. You also have this sort of cross-stakeholder reach component. So there's really no other unit at an institution that has those working relationships across every department on campus. AI implementations decisions, these are made, that are made in silos tend to fail. So libraries sort of touch everything. And that's a really important role to play, that coordination and understanding, what different stakeholders need. And then finally, there's this incredibly complex area of, licensing, rights, privacy, compliance. This is something that libraries have been doing for decades, right? So this is something that transfers directly to the tool evaluation in AI tools, and as well as, crafting institutional policy. All of these things are things that naturally occur with the library, and so I think the library will be, way, way more important going forward than it even has been so far. And just to sort of drive home this point, I can also list a lot of bad stuff that happens if you don't have some leadership from librarians on AI. So, we all know, and Drew was talking about this earlier, fabricated citations are a real problem. We're going to talk about how Scite overcomes a lot of that problem, but we do need people who are in the loop to ensure that the work that's being produced is using real references. And also this issue of unattributed text. So basically, this sort of longstanding ethical question of we have text that's generated by AI. What do we call that? How do we assign that, as having responsibility with an author in the same way? Without some leadership there, you're going to have continued confusion about this. And this is something that I talk about with my colleagues at the university all the time. Similarly, research quality issues, hallucinated references, unverified data coming out of these systems, basically a kind of equity gap. So there's always this question of, those who have access to, quality tools versus free AI tools. If you've not used like a paid version of ChatGPT or Claude and sort of compared it to what the free versions are doing, you really are. There's a big difference in terms of the quality of the experience. And so trying to sort of ease some of those inequities is definitely something that we can point to as a good role for the library leadership. And then, we get into more broader issues about like institutional reputation, right? So if there are high profile AI misuse cases, that's something that, gets missed without input from stakeholders at the library. Same thing for institutional preparedness. When I teach, I build in big components about, guiding students through, how to use this technology ethically and effectively. But librarians are in a, even better position to really take the reins there and sort of provide instruction. We need instruction that comes not just from individual professors like me, but also from other people at the university who have expertise in, not just the particular domains of the subject matter that they're teaching, but in information science and information, curation itself, right? And so that's where the library comes in. And then finally, there are costs associated, with misconduct, retractions. These are things that the library can guard against through AI investments. So again, lots of good things happen when we get buy-in from librarians and from libraries, and lots of bad things happen or could happen if you don't. So you can think about this. I'll just go over a few of these different points. You can think about this as having, what we're calling a four-pillar implementation framework. So there are basically four things, four sort of things that we want to ground everything in. Training and education, tool evaluation, policy and guidelines, and implementation. So I've already talked about this a little bit. So for training and education, one thing that we need to focus on, and one area where the library is really important, is a focus on critical evaluation, and doing that over and above, the prohibition of these tools. I think, the slides we saw just a few minutes ago that Drew was talking about, and the title of this talk is People at Your Institution Are Using This Technology. The way I put it is it's too good not to use. You're not going to keep it from being used. And so you need to teach people how to use it effectively. And you can do that with training sessions for faculty as well as students. This can be through like workshops on AI literacy, and then, collaborations with individual departments to develop discipline-specific modules that are, provide training specifically related to a given department or a given field. Also, in terms of the evaluations of individual tools. So these are things where, you have specific competency about, source quality, the accuracy and transparency of the output that tools give. And where you can really get some buy-in in terms of prioritizing the tracking of different citations and verifying sources that come out of AI interactions. And then also the process of testing tools for accuracy in different subject areas. This is a great point of collaboration, I think, from librarians and individual faculty members and, maybe graduate students. Uh, in terms of policy and guidelines, I'm a big academic freedom guy as a professor. This is a big thing that's important to me. So I would never suggest that institutions should have like really strict policies at the top level. But what I'm a big advocate of is more generalized policies or generalized guidelines. And those should be clear about how AI should be used. They should include some kind of disclosure requirement for when AI assisted work is used in, say, a tenure or promotion evaluation. This is actually a thing that I was just on the committee at my institution. We were crafting policies about, when do you have to disclose and how should that disclosure be provided. These are things that are really going to be really important going forward. You can, collaborate in terms of, faculties redesigning courses, and then reviewing and revising policies as new technologies emerge. I have found myself revising the content and the way that I do assessment much more frequently over the past few years because this technology exists to integrate it and integrate newer versions of the technology. So this is something that definitely we need the library's help with. And then finally, in terms of implementation, we are big advocates of pilot programs, maybe even with select departments. I'll talk about LibGuides here in just a second. But more broadly, offering consultations for faculty, like we said, in terms of assignment redesign and building up partnerships with IT and connecting those with academic departments. And then documenting different outcomes, providing case studies and providing usage metrics. We'll actually see some dashboards and some things that Scite provides here in just a few minutes, so you can see exactly who's using what. That kind of data curation is going to be important to ensure that we know what tools are being used and how frequently. So there are a few different points of collaboration, I think, for librarians and faculty. So I already talked about a few of these. We can think about workshops, but you could even think about like co-teaching AI evaluation skills, right? This is a great point where you can have subject matter experts in a given department work with librarians to really emphasize how to use that technology in a given area. In terms of assignments, crafting different assignments that are designed with this technology in mind. Same thing for research consultation and coming up with AI aware citation practices, forming those guidelines. And then in terms of research support, so we're in the age of literature reviews that are going to be AI at least enhanced, if not in some cases AI generated, and how we feel about that probably depends on your department or your field or what policies you have. But definitely that's a point where you can get a lot of collaboration between the library and individual faculty members in terms of figuring out what the expectation should be, identifying different data sets, managing citations. Here's the big one that always comes up is grant proposal support and figuring out what sort of AI use is acceptable in terms of crafting a grant proposal. And then, providing faculty workshops about ethical AI use, more specific to the discipline applications. Being innovative with our teaching with AI tools. This is something that I know a lot of folks struggle with, and I totally understand. A lot of the ways that we do teaching has really been upended by this, and I've had to reinvent the wheel in a lot of cases, because I recognize that students are going to have access to this technology, and I can't just do reaction writings in the same way that I did, a few years ago. So all of these things are points of collaboration between librarians and university faculty, and I think there's a lot of progress that can be made there. So we do have a few templates, or I guess one template for LibGuides. This is available, and I think someone's going to share it in the chat here in just a second. But basically, what the idea is that this incorporates successful elements from a number of different institutions. And so, Purdue, Oregon State. And the idea is that it provides an overview about a number of things that we've talked about here, our smart citations technology, some step-by-step access for institutional subscriptions, some really practical examples of use cases with real-world applications, optimizing guidance for researchers with more advanced settings, and then some common Q&A stuff as well. So this is sort of ready-made for you to sort of use as a starting place for your institution, and you can kind of jump off from there. And now I'll hand it back over to Drew.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Okay, so now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about more practical tools, practical tactics here. Sean and I will set the stage a little bit on some things, talk about MCP, some of these analytic tools to provide more visibility into that. And then I will do a demonstration, walk through what does this actually look like as an MCP inside of some of these tools. So first, everyone's using these. I mean, as we asked in that poll up front, AI is a change agent. It's a exponential growth. It's going to keep changing just across all facets of society. So really, our interest in what we're doing at Scite is figuring out ways that we can answer these bigger questions and figure out how to help the discovery process, to help the research workflows in all of these different tools, since things are being used across a wide range. And MCP is a great way to enable that because, as I mentioned before, it's a standardized protocol. So it gets adopted by all of these tools in the same way. So we can provide that technology in a really easy to use, accessible way that doesn't require IT teams or extensive API setup or programming knowledge. You can just do this really easily inside of these tools. So the Scite MCP is a simple connector that you can add into ChatGPT, Claude, Copilot, all sorts of tools that accept MCP servers, and just think about it as a connector to that data. So you're asking your normal question in ChatGPT, but with the Scite connector there alongside you, you can ask more specific questions about research. And ChatGPT now has that at its disposal. It's going to be able to ask those questions. We're going to hand back a response of raw data that we're handling some ranking on, that's pulling from that full text, that's pulling from that smart citation network that you can then get in your responses. And you can always ask about the source. You can ask about all of the context around that as well. There's no re-architecture for you or your team. There's no big IT project. This really is about tapping into the subscriptions that you're already starting to pay for with ChatGPT and Claude. They're already there, and we're seeing this happen more and more, which is why we took the steps to make this available, to bring Scite into a more easy to access place for everyone. So our MCP, as I mentioned, stands for Model Context Protocol, which is an open source standard which allows AI applications to connect to these external systems. So what can you actually expect when you ask these questions? You're going to be able to ask natural language questions like you would with any LLM, but you can leverage answers that are grounded in science. So AI will actually look at those result sets that comes from that same network of full text research that it's going to search. You can verify the claims, you can verify the accuracy, you can understand what has the highest supporting counts or contrasting counts, you can understand where the research stands because of that rich context we're providing. And then really valuably, you can also connect to your own holdings. So if you have access to specific journals, you can bring those back in and we can handle that access resolution so that the LLM is also bolstered with that same information. And this is supported in all of the major LLMs, and we've seen use cases across a wide range. We see actually are over 5 million tool uses and counting now. So this is just something that we launched at the end of February. We've kind of just offered it for people to use it and then increasing that over time. We're seeing more and more use cases, getting feedback, and then making it better and better as we can. So the MCP primarily adds these three key capabilities, and we like to call these out because these are really specific. It's tied to what Scite does, and it's also different from what others might do. We do a full text search. This is not just titles and abstracts, it's not just metadata. Other tools do just search those things, but Scite searches inside the papers themselves. It's looking across a broad range. So we have over 280 million data sets across articles, book chapters, preprints, and other data sets in addition to that, that pulls in that information, that pulls in that full text across these publisher agreements that we have in place to reach into the full text there, as well as open access content. And that pulls back in those results that get used inside of ChatGPT or Claude. You get those smart citation signals. So is it supporting? Is it contrasting? Is it mentioning? You understand the general citation graph so that AI can have some better signals to understand which findings deserve more weight, which ones should come back, and how the response should be based on that context. So again, trying to provide more context to it. And that's really a theme for a lot of what we do, is trying to provide that context because, and I even see some Q&A questions popping up around this too, with just AI and research and making sure that we're actually going all the way to the source for validating things. We don't want to make it so easy because part of the research process is tracing that lineage of thought to improve it, to grow it, and build on top of that foundation. So this signal really helps the LLMs provide better answers that get you started faster to go down that path and to find that right research that fits where you can validate it yourself. And then the built-in access resolution. So this is getting all the way to the paper, not just the reference. It's understanding the source material. Finding that paper is really just part of it, but Scite is going to resolve the best path. So we have a very long kind of list of access resolution that we do, going from open access PDFs to any institutional holdings that you have through specific integrations like libkey or getftr. We do proxy links. We've handled a wide range of use cases here to, again, give you the response and make it easy so that you can get all the way to that ultimate source material as fast as you can. So, the speed is there to get it in front of you so you can spend more time getting to that source material. All right, Sean, I'm going to hand it back over to you. Talk about the budget case.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. So, really, I think the Scite MCP is sort of sitting in this unique position, between different AI tools and different content holdings that your institution probably already has, right? So, if you're subscribing to ChatGPT or Claude, or Copilot, and you've also got library holdings, subscriptions to that. Scite MCP is really sort of sitting in the middle as what we think of as a connection layer, really connecting that underlying technology to Scite's data, and then again also to the holdings that you have at your library, different databases, institutional repositories, all of that. So we're providing that link sort of all in one place. And so, the idea of sort of bringing everything together is sort of what we're all about, right? The idea of, making sure that those things are linked together so you don't have sort of siloed tools or siloed subscriptions that, don't have any sort of way of talking to each other or interacting with each other. We do a number of things, and you'll see this in more detail in just one second, but we provide good admin analytics for Scite MCP. So we provide just a basic overview as well as information on, papers that are pulled into AI sessions that can be tracked at the level of the DOI. Usage and audit logs, even, session details in terms of timestamps or paper IDs. We work with libkey and open URLs so we can resolve papers against your library holdings automatically. So it's quite seamless, full text access. And then, you can help you sort of establish, what the real demand signal is from researcher activity. And so this can be used to help you inform, in terms of, what your budget decisions are going to be, in terms of future subscriptions or, where you need to point your focus towards. And then, of course, we have compliance stats through counter reports that can be useful for renewals as well as publisher negotiations. Um, and actually, I don't have a whole lot else to say over that because I believe Drew's going to, in just one second, go over a little more detail about the actual dashboard itself. This is just sort of an overview of what you can see through the MCP administration, but I will hand it back to him.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, as Sean mentioned, I'll go a little bit deeper and show a live instance of this just with like an internal example account to show what this looks like here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We're going to jump over here and going to walk through some different things. So if you go to scite.ai/MCP, which we'll put that link in the chat, this gives you an overview of our MCP, how to set it up in different environments we've talked about because there's lots of different flavors of tools that accept MCPs. But this is sharing a lot of the same information we've talked about. You can see that we're over 5 million uses and counting on this one. We have some setup instructions and we continue to improve this over time as we get feedback from different users. I've seen some Q&A questions around, does it work in this tool or that tool? Generally, it works in across the board. There's small variations. And as we learn through conversations, if something doesn't work quite right, we will change that. But I encourage you to go here if you want to check it out, get some answers. We have a lot of information on this page for you. I'm going to close this to jump over to ChatGPT. So I have ChatGPT here. This is a free account. So I'm not paying for ChatGPT here. We use Claude at our company, and that's primarily what we use. I'll walk through an example there. But I want to set this up from scratch in ChatGPT just to show how easy it is. So you can see in the sidebar, there's an area called apps. They all call them something a little different. These are MCPs, but they're called apps inside of ChatGPT. Claude calls them connectors. I'm not sure. I think they get called different things depending on where they're being set up. If I type in Scite here, you'll see the app pops up. I can open this up. It has additional information, but I can just hit connect here. I get a button to sign in with Scite. It's going to jump over to an account. I'm already signed in another session, so it jumped here. It lets me authorize that. So I'm going to authorize the MCP. So this will go through a connection I have with our sister product called Article Galaxy. So we have a connection there that does more full article fulfillment and document delivery. You can ignore that part. If it's straight through Scite, it will be faster. It'll just sign in, you authorize it, and it'll jump right back. And then you can see this will authorize inside of ChatGPT, and then we will get a button that we can use to jump right into a chat with it. This is a live demo, so there's always a curse of internet woes or ChatGPT woes or something going on, but this should work in a moment here. If it does not, we'll jump over to Claude and I'll show an example there. I've not seen it take this long before, so it's usually very fast. All right, my patience is running out there. So what we'll do, we'll let that run, see if it fixes itself. If it doesn't, I can jump back over there. I'm going to start a new chat here inside of Claude. So the call out I have here is, it's a very similar experience depending on what tool you're using. They all handle it a little bit different, but in general, they're largely the same. So I'm going to keep checking over here because it's going to bother me. Let's just try one more time, actually, because I believe. Authorize. If this doesn't work, I will officially give up on it. Okay, we'll let that run. So back over here in Claude, if you hit the plus here, like I mentioned, they call them different things. Claude calls them connectors. You can see we have other things in our account configured. We even have a separate Article Galaxy MCP. I like to call this out because MCPs are particularly useful because they can actually communicate with one another. So you can have a single conversation in Claude and you can orchestrate a conversation across MCPs. So you can ask questions to do two different ones and they can do different things in the same thread. So there's a lot of potentially powerful things you can do from a research perspective there. But you can see I have Scite enabled here. Question that commonly gets asked. So ChatGPT, you connect that specifically. Claude will determine what tool to use. I will often, in the prompt itself, I might say something like using Scite just to be certain. The reason I call that out is because LLMs do have their own training data. So depending on the research question you ask, it might try and pull from that in its own training data instead of Scite. I do this with my first question if it's broad enough because I want to just make sure it's using Scite there. So I'm going to use this question here, this prompt that came up. This was actually my wife is hard of hearing in one of her ears. She had a friend that told her that there's a link, and I started kind of saying, hey, that's actually a really good research question. A lot of times starting with, hey, is there a relationship between these two things? You get a lot of really good literature around that. So you can see Claude is exposing some of these thinking steps here. So it's showing loading tools, which is really just calling Scite. So you can see our little logo here. You can see that it called search literature. If I expanded this, it will show these individual steps that the LLM is going through. And you can see it's actually calling Scite itself. So it's sending a term, it's sending specific supporting information, different parameters. And I call this out because it's actually really interesting because it's getting responses back from Scite and using the LLM itself. So Claude is determining whether those are the right findings. And you'll see a lot of calls will happen if you ask a broad question like this at first, because it's going to run multiple queries, look at different sets of data. It's going to come back and try and massage it into a good response based off of that. But as we continue our conversation here, it will actually leverage what already came back since it pulled those results. So it usually comes back a little bit faster. But you can see here is the short answer is that there is a relationship and there's some budding research on this more recently. So I think this was why, again, another good topic to explore, but you can obviously ask any research question that you want. There's research papers on pretty much anything at this point, and that's continuing to grow. But this summarizes it. I just asked a broad question, so you're going to get a broad LLM response. If you want a very specific format, you can do that. I'm going to do something a little more specific. So obviously using Scite and the smart citations data itself, we want to be able to ask a question like show me the citations. We'll say show me the citations for the research in a simple table. So just if we want to see, say, sorted by most supported. So we'll just ask a simple question here to follow up on that research. So again, it's going to build off of what information it already has, what I've already queried. It's going to pull that back. Claude does do some unique things with some inline visuals. Sometimes it gets a little fancy here. I said simple table because I wanted to just print out a text-based table. Sometimes it will generate a more visual graphic, which is also really powerful. While that runs, I'm going to touch on a couple things here because I also want to make sure we have time for Q&A. We do have this site called citedemos.com. We'll also put that link in the chat. These are all example artifacts that have been built out of Claude using the Scite MCP. So we're looking at data across our papers, but we also have data for patents, for grants, for clinical trials, regulatory and device data sets. We're adding more drugs, compounds. There's lots that we're adding and expanding here. And there's a lot of really cool, rich HTML artifacts that were built out of this. You can, on any of these, you can look at the prompt if you're curious, how this was built. You can download it as a PDF or view the live version. This particular one was tracing this lineage of this 2005 paper on mRNA and how that changed when the pandemic happened in 2019, 2020, and how patents started to proliferate. So it's a visual report backed by all that smart citation data. It has interactive charts in it. This was a very simple prompt. Could have taken weeks or months for a developer to build this and create this artifact. You'd have to design it and build it. Claude did this in probably 10 minutes. It was more advanced than other things, but it happened really fast. And this shows a lot of really rich data and it's visualized this way. And I like to call this out because we all have different mental models for how we want to visualize information. And it's basically as easy as whatever you want to prompt to get that information. So there's a lot of artifacts on this site specifically. If you want to look at these examples, we're always people are sharing them with us all the time, things they've created. And even in classes, I've talked to professors that have shown different visuals to their students. Just it's something that we're always interested in. Coming back over to Claude real quick, we can see that it did do a fancier table here, but it's showing that smart citation data. So it's ranking all the papers and it's showing this top paper. Here are the authors. Here's the title. You can see the link in the bottom left is going to doi.org. I could ask for a specific site link. It could handle access resolution if you wanted to your institutional holdings. But again, trying to surface the real paper so you can go trace this all the way through the journal, the year, and then we're getting our information. So this one's the most highly supported paper on this topic, showing the total number of sites, which is a useful indicator, but not as useful as understanding how much of that citation information is actually supported and having that all the way through here. So you can ask lots of questions. You can keep building on this. I usually start broad and kind of narrow down and then create an artifact, create a literature review, a Word document, a PowerPoint. You can generate all sorts of things out of this, and even living dashboards that you can generate off this data. And it's really, really powerful. This is still bothering me, so I'm gonna check. It's still loading. And then last thing I wanna talk about here before we'll switch over to Q&A. Sean mentioned this with a couple screenshots, but we are providing MCP admin analytics for a lot of things. So you can ignore there's sort of a mountain of toggles here for different data sets we've been enabling, but you get some good overview information around AI reads. AI reads is a unique metric that we're tracking, which is essentially when you call Claude, if it queries and looks up Scite one time, but it returns 10 papers, that's 10 AI reads. So we're kind of tracking that in general, as well as the number of unique papers and any users or session information. There's also some information around, what you could access inside of those tools in terms of publishers and journals that you have access to. Usage information, which is really just charting how that works across total number of reads and articles and sessions. We mentioned the libkey and open URL. This is something that's only configurable here with your account behind the scenes. It has to be configured by an administrator. We're also surfacing collection gaps, which is a really interesting one in the academic space because you're able to see what papers are missing or what you need to procure to figure out how you can fulfill that. So there's a lot of gaps here that are shown in terms of the paper, the title, the journal, what publisher, how many times, how many unique users, and you could download or export this data if you need to. And then lastly on this list, we do have some counter style usage reports. I say counter style because counter is a specific specification, but they don't have AI reads as a metric they track. We're actually working with them to get that part of the official spec. But otherwise, everything else comes back here in terms of total reads, the unique articles, unique users, unique sessions, so that you can get more insight into this. So that's the last thing I'm going to close out here with. I'm going to do one last check. Nope, it didn't do it. We're going to switch back over to slides and then get into the Q&A. I think Sean, is this one? I think this is you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. It was just having to take a second for it to come up. Yeah. So if you're interested in evaluating this, I believe the link has already been shared in the chat, scite.ai/MCP. It'll sort of guide you through the process of how to set up Scite for, any of the products that we've been talking about. And then, if you're interested in more information, you can always contact our team through either contact sales or the requested demo link that Julia has shared in the in chat. And yeah, so with that, thank you so much for your time, and we're happy to take any questions at this point.
Okay, great. Thanks, John and Drew. Yeah, we have a few minutes left, so if you haven't put a question in the Q&A yet, feel free to do so. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like to be addressed. We'll be going based on the most upvotes, so that's a helpful tool. Okay, so it looks like our most popular question comes in from Alan, who says, there's currently a fun kerfuffle online where one hapless researcher, was crying about Archive, the preprint server, instituting penalties where it is clear that the author did not read the papers they cited. The researcher was shocked that people would expect him to read all the articles he cites. My question here is, at what point does the conveniences afforded by tools like Scite or Consensus disrupt the fundamental assumption of research that the researcher read and understood the research they're citing?
Yeah, so I love this, and this is I'm familiar with the kerfuffle to which you refer, Alan. Yeah, so I think the first thing I'd say is that this is actually an issue that I think goes back longer than we might recognize. I've been doing this for over a decade, and I can definitely tell you that I've had graduate students who have cited things that they didn't read, and I've had to point that out to them, and we've had to have a difficult conversation about that, and that kind of thing has been going back, has been going on for a long time. But I think, more to the point about AI in particular, at what point does that, convenience really, sort of allow us to not read the source material? Depending on the use case, we may be there in some instances. And I'll just go ahead and say, I mean, as an academic, there are plenty of paper. I mean, well, there are plenty of papers that I read I go over them with a fine tooth comb and I'm taking notes with everything and I'm getting into great detail and I'm doing all of that. But there are some other papers that, maybe I'm interested in just one particular statistic or one particular methodology that I haven't read anywhere nearly as carefully as I have, papers that are in my area. And so I think probably, and again, this has been a thing that, professors and students have been doing for a long time. And I imagine this will be just an extension of that existing practice where there are going to be some papers that I might be comfortable getting an AI overview of. But then, the ones that are central to my research, obviously there's no excuse for ever not reading those central papers. So it's probably just more of that sort of evolution going on.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you. Let's see. Another question. I think you all talked about how Scite connects with what a library is subscribed to. But David asks, the library already pays to subscribe to the content with annual costs. It sounds like Scite did not have to buy the content or isn't having to pay for it annually. And would be charging more beyond the existing subscriptions we're already paying for. So how does it work, basically?
John, you want to take it or you want me
Oh
to?
yeah, sure. No, yeah, sure. Basically, Scite's access to the data is completely aside of whatever your institutional subscriptions are. So everything that Drew talked about in terms of supporting, mentioning, contrasting, is from our arrangements with publishers, and that doesn't get passed on to you in any way. We do have those integrations that we talked about in terms of like with libkey or OpenURL that interface with your collection, but that doesn't bring any additional cost to it beyond like what libkey is going to require of you. In terms of, there is a little bit of a complication there in terms of MCP, in terms of what we can show you. So that will sometimes depend on your institutional subscriptions. But that is really just, you can take that as far as you want, right? So, MCP can show you, work with open access papers all day long with no problem. But institutional subscriptions can sort of expand what Scite has access to. Drew, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on to that. Uh, Good.
No, I think you covered it.
Cool. Thanks.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Let's see. A question from Emma. Can faculty set up Scite to connect with the library's holdings without alerting the library? As someone mentioned with usage above, I would want to know if our users set this up and was using it to comb our databases. Also, I'm a bit concerned about any conflicts with copyright and not uploading copyrighted works into an LLM. Or is this only open access? So I think a couple questions in there.
Yeah, I can answer some of that, and Sean, you can jump in if you need to. No, you have like no one could set this up without to access to institutional holdings at the individual level without going through your administrator. You need an organization account. We need to set it up kind of on the back end, so an individual couldn't just go in there and get access to that. We do have obviously the full text of publisher content that's behind the paywall that we have agreements with, as well as open access content, as well as your institutional access that you have that comes through. So it really depends on that front. It's not only OA, but in terms of the copyrights, I mean, Sean can say this too. We're very aware of that. We have very good relationships with publishers. We're very conservative on those too, and make sure that we're respectful. And we work with lots of universities and institutions around that. So we're always making sure that that's compliant.
Right. Looks like we might have time for one more. We're quick. Um, let's see. I think there's a couple of questions about de-skilling when it comes to research because of AI, generative AI tools. Um, so maybe I'll just keep it there with open on, on any thoughts on that.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So the thing that I think we need to be aware of is what's commonly called in the literature cognitive offloading, where you're basically getting the machine to do your thinking for you. You know, we're in a position where we could get a real Matthew effect, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If you know how to use this technology as a thinking partner to help you understand concepts and ideas and findings, you're going to do really well. If you're just using it to get out of doing whatever it is you have to do, that's going to hurt you in the long run. And so this is where, the impetus is on, professors, librarians, is on us to make sure that we are telling people to do the first thing. Use it as a thinking partner. Use it as, I don't really care if students don't have the ability to use a card catalog, right? They shouldn't have that ability. That's not a good use of your time, right? You should be using, Google or AI to find literature. I'm less concerned about skill loss as I am about, like I said, cognitive offloading, and that's the thing that we really need to focus on in the classroom and in the library. So, in my opinion.
Right, okay, and looks like we're at time, so I will wrap up and say thanks so much to Sean and Drew for taking the time to speak with us today, and thank you to our attendees for your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from the webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Thanks.